Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, October 9th, 2019. Now, I'm sure you're probably aware, but late last year, the federal government formalized a ban on bump stock devices. And last December, they gave people 90 days to destroy these things or turn them in. Now, at that time, it was estimated that there were about 500,000 or as many as 500,000. I've seen some lower numbers, some a little bit higher than 500,000 of these devices around the country. Whatever the number is, there are a lot of them, hundreds of thousands of them around the country. And now, thanks to a Freedom of Information Act report from the Washington Times that was released just a few days ago, we know how many were turned in to the ATF during the initial ban period. And I think you're going to find it very interesting. It's a very low number, I'll tell you that. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But I think it's low enough where it gives us some hope going forward, but we'll see how it plays out. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We have a video live version plus an archived video version and also an audio-only podcast edition. You can find all of the channels we broadcast on, all of our archives, all the ways to subscribe and follow us, our social media channels, email newsletter, membership support where you can pitch in a couple of bucks a month to help us out. Find that all over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And this morning, just a quick brief hello to everyone out in the live chat, whatever channel you're on. I really appreciate you being here with me. Today, I'm skipping over some back and forth and answering questions in the chat because I have an appointment that I have to get to. So I do apologize for that. But we're going to have a shorter, more concise show today. You're all excited for that, right? Anyways, let's get to it. Starting with this report to cover what was going on late last year. First of all, Donald Trump, quoted in the New York Times, says, quote, "So we're knocking out bump stocks." This was in November of 2018. We're knocking out bump stocks. This was a conference announcing a revamped trade agreement with Canada. "I've told the NRA," Donald Trump says, "I've told them bump stocks are gone." And then he added, "And over the next couple of weeks, I'll be able to write it up." And that was November 28th, I believe, scrolling up, November 28th, 2018. And the proposed rule that was published by the Department of Justice for the Federal Register, it says this. I just got an excerpt of this so you get a general idea of what's going on. And I don't get into too many details for people who do know what's going on. It proposes to amend the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives regulations to clarify that bump fire stocks, slide fire devices, and devices with certain similar characteristics, which they call bump stock type devices, they are now machine guns, as defined by the National Firearms Act of 1934 and the Gun Control Act of 1968. Now, you've heard me say, if you've watched or listened to this show for any period of time, anytime I talk about the right to keep and bear arms, I always point out that the NFA and the Gun Control Act and all of these federal gun control rules and laws and regulations, they're all illegal and shouldn't exist. But that's not the conversation we're necessarily having, although that really is the underlying principle that we have to hold to. So what they're doing here is they're taking laws that were already passed, whether we can argue that they shouldn't exist, but they're taking these things that are on the books and being enforced by every administration since. And what they're doing is they're just changing the definition of a device, a bump stock fire device, and calling it a machine gun to enable them to control and prohibit it under those laws that were passed before 1934 and 1968. So I wrote an article about this, covering it just a couple weeks later, or shortly after that, December 18th, 2018. This was the day that the administration formally rolled out the regulation. That was the proposal that I read to you. The final version is basically the same thing. And here from my report, anyone who possesses one of these devices will have 90 days to turn it in or destroy it once the final rule is published in the Federal Register. And that did happen shortly after. right about Christmas time. So Merry Christmas, America. The NRA-backed Trump administration gives you more gun control. Wow, that is just awful. And I did point out in that article that this whole thing is notable considering the fact that the Obama administration did not believe that federal law allowed it to ban bump stocks. Check out this quote from the Obama administration, their ATF technology chief. Quote, "The stock has no automatically functioning mechanical parts or springs and performs no automatic mechanical function when installed. Accordingly, we find that the bump stock is a firearm part and is not regulated as a firearm under the Gun Control Act or the National Firearms Act." So the Obama administration actually looked at doing this type of approach, and the gun grabbers of the Obama administration said, no, that's pushing it too far. But it certainly wasn't too far for the current administration, because that's exactly what they did. They looked at the same thing that the Obama administration said, well, we don't have the legal authority to do this. I'm sure they wanted to, but if they're wanting to and saying that they can't, and then the next people come along, what does that tell you about the next people? And what kind of precedent is that going to set for the future? Now, an article that we published from TJ Martinell, who does a lot of great work with us on the right to keep and bear arms. He's a great writer. He pointed out this, quote, "President Obama directed the ATF to pursue a possible ban on the M855 ammo. To do so, they released a proposed agency rule which redefined M855 green tip ammo as armor piercing to qualify it for federal prohibition under the Gun Control Act of 1968. So the Obama administration didn't totally reject this approach. They liked this approach. They used this approach to try to ban M855 ammo. They wanted to just say, well, now this is armor piercing, so now we can ban that. And there was a great deal of opposition to that from where you'd expect it. Now, the Trump administration is doing the exact same thing. And again, the Obama administration didn't think they could do this with bump stocks, even though they attempted to, or they were looking at it and they rejected the idea. So I just wanted to point that out because I think it's important for us to acknowledge who the opposition to the right to keep and bear arms is. And when it comes to Washington, D.C., it's basically everybody. So what's happened? They had 90 days, 500,000 or so of these, maybe 250,000, hundreds of thousands of these in circulation, I guess, as a currency maybe, around the country. And what happened? Well, the Washington Times published just earlier this week, I saw through a tweet from Gun Owners of America. You should follow gun owners on Twitter if you're over there. But check out this report. The federal government collected fewer than 1,000 bump stocks during the run-up to a new ban in March, despite estimates that hundreds of thousands of the devices that mimic machine gun fire are in circulation, according to federal data provided to the Washington Times by the Justice Department. They go on. Between the issuance of the final rule banning the devices in December 2018, right around Christmas, they had the publication of the final rule. And then from December 2018 and April 4th, 2019, shortly after the prohibition took effect in late March, I think it was the 26th, 582 bump stocks were, quote, abandoned to the BATFE, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, according to Justice Department records. And 98 bump stocks were kept as evidence. The Times obtained the records through a Freedom of Information Act request. The administration said that there's somewhere between 280,000 and 520,000 that were in circulation last December. So they were looking to have 500,000 of these destroyed or turned in. And so far, the feds have only had less than 600. And now my math is absolutely terrible. Let's do this. Let's just do it with 500,000 of them. 582. So it's like about 1/10, it's 0.001164, about 1/10% of these were turned into the federal government. To me, amongst all the really bad things that we face, this is really, really good news. Now that, of course, is not the final number. It only went until April, but this is the time. People had 90 days to turn them in, and on the day of turning them in, plus another week, week and a half later, only a few hundred were turned into the feds. That's incredibly positive. Now, and I know that there have been others, like there was a a so-called buyback program. I hate that term, but that's what we know them as, these buyback program. One of them was done in Washington State. Maybe 1,000 or so were traded in for the bribe money that they have, I guess, but they ran out of taxpayer funds for that program. So maybe 1,000 there. Maybe let's say a few other states had a similar situation, but we're still only talking a few thousand out of 500,000, less than 1%, maybe 0.5% in the first 90 or 100 days. Now, there's probably more that have been turned in since, but the numbers are very slow. And this is really what the founders told us you were supposed to do. And I'm going to get to James Madison, what he had to say in Federalist 46 on how to defeat federal programs that you either disagree with or find unconstitutional. So first of all, we know that the ATF, like every other federal agency, and all those that shouldn't exist, and even the ones that do exist, they have an Achilles heel. They have a manpower, they have a resources problem. And in this article here that I'm also going to put in our show notes, the federal government relies heavily on state cooperation to implement and enforce almost all of its laws, regulations, and acts, including gun control. We know that the ATF has just over 5,000 employees for the entire country. It might be as high as 5,200 or so now. About a third of those are in administration. So less than 4,000 employees are doing enforcement actions for the ATF for the entire country. And year in and year out, they close somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 cases every single year. Sometimes it's a little higher, sometimes it's a little lower, you get a little outlier, but basically their resources and manpower allow them that kind of a workload. So we're talking 10,000 of them. We now say, let's say there's 400,000 bump stocks left. That's a lot. So in this article, it says, in theory, and I think this was from my article again. It seemed familiar as I'm reading through this. I'm like, I know these talking points. So I wrote, in theory, let's say there were 10 or 11 million people owning undocumented short-barreled shotguns in violation of the National Firearms Act of 1934. There is absolutely no way that the federal government would have the resources to stop them without significant support from state and local law enforcement. And I would say even with state and local law enforcement. So we're talking 5,000 employees. They can close 8,000 to 10,000 cases. So if there's 400,000 of these owned by more than 10,000 people, there's no way that they have the resources and the manpower to stop everyone from possessing this particular device that is illegal. And this is, again, like I was saying just briefly a few minutes ago, this is just what James Madison told us to do in Federalist 46. He gave us basically a 4-step blueprint on how to defeat, to undermine, to reject, and effectively nullify federal programs. And those federal programs he called either warrantable, those were ones that were within the confines of the Constitution, but bad policy that the people don't like, or unwarrantable, those that are not authorized by the Constitution. So the strategy works either way. And the 4 steps include being really upset, protesting, he called it the disquietude of the people, the frowns of the executive magistracy of the state. So state governors should actually be standing up and bringing attention to these issues. Legislative devices, so state legislatures should be using tools to undermine the federal program as well. But the kind of the important money shot of these points here is this: a repugnance and refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Now, if you look at a dictionary of the time, so for example, Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, you know the word repugnance didn't mean grossed out, for example. It actually meant disobedience. The word repugnance was defined as disobedient, not obsequious, and obsequious meant compliant. So do not comply. So James Madison said the people's repugnance, the people's disobedience, and non-compliance. Plus, he also suggested a direct refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Again, his words. And he said if enough people, enough states do this, this would create a situation where the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. He says, where the sentiments of several adjoining states happen to be in union. So if people were taking these steps in multiple states, this would present obstructions which the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. So the bottom line is, if you want to defeat a federal program, you want to stop Washington, D.C., you absolutely have to defy and resist them. And I'm not talking about the fake resistance that comes out of the Democratic Party, where they pretend to resist the Trump administration, but continue giving him all kinds of powers and demanding more and more power for the executive branch. They just want their own person to have that power. They just don't like the guy who's in there. That's not real resistance. Resistance is actually opposing things. So refusal to cooperate with officers of the union, a non-compliance, a repugnance, as James Madison used it, that is a real resistance. And we're starting to see some of that resistance clearly. Whether people are actively taking this mindset or not, I don't know. And we don't know the actual numbers. We won't know for quite some time, probably. But the early reports being in, just hundreds, if not maybe a few thousand of these turned in, as the federal government has demanded, when there are hundreds of thousands of them around the country, is absolutely following James Madison's advice to defeat that federal program. And for those of us who believe in liberty, we certainly want that to continue. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you learned something and you found it educational. I hope it was enjoyable to watch. I hope I did a good job explaining what was going on. I do apologize for the shorter episode than usual, but we'll be back on the normal schedule coming pretty soon after our Fast Friday edition in a couple of days, but back on the normal schedule next week. I'm very grateful for you spending some time with me today. Make sure if you like the program, smash the like button, subscribe, leave some comments, share the link. Reviews on iTunes. And of course, if you want to pitch in financially, as little as $2 a month goes a long, long way here at the little grassroots TAC that could. The link for that is 10thAmendmentCenter.com/members. I really appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me today. I'm glad to share some good news. I think this is a very positive development. Hopefully we'll see more of this on more issues in the future. And I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty. Have a great day.